Aikwe, Neknamalita, and this is my channel, The Midnight Librarian. Today I will be going over my Indigathon TBR, my Nonfiction November TBR, some of which do overlap, as well as hopefully give you some recommendations for both of these. Please bear with me, I am getting over a cold. It is not COVID. I caught what is commonly known locally as the Humboldt crud. So I'm still a little congested, and of course, if for some reason, as soon as I step in front of a camera, whether it be my own or Zoom, everything acts up. I end up coughing, sneezing, getting a runny nose, or just getting more congested than usual and like tearing up for some reason. So bear with me as we go through this. So Indigathon is hosted by Bear to Brody and Michelle from Thor Wants Another Letter. This is a month-long readathon, basically inspiring and encouraging you to pick up Indigenous authored books throughout the month of November, which is Indigenous Heritage Month. Now, you should be picking up these books outside of this month, as you would with books by Black authors or book by LGBTQ authors, etc. I would hope that you would be picking up Indigenous books outside of November, but this is just kind of an encouragement to do so. So this is the, I believe, third year that Bear and Michelle have been doing this readathon. It's a little more lax this year than it was last year. They have several prompts that I will go over, as well as their own recommendations for these prompts. And yeah, like I said, it goes from November 1st to the 30th. Nonfiction November is being hosted by Olive from abookolive. Again, another month-long readathon. I love those. This one is to encourage you to read nonfiction, and of which I have found that I am reading more and more of, so this feels very appropriate. And of course, there are several nonfiction books that I would like to get to in the month of November. Not that I think that I need to read any more of them. Based off my latest stats, nonfiction has been about a quarter of what I read so far this year. I believe I tend to read 2 to 3 nonfiction books throughout each month. So, but there are some Indigenous authored or nonfiction books that I would like to get to. Once again, Olive has some prompts for this readathon as well. And this has been going on for, I believe, 7 years now. So yeah, I hope to go over some of my picks. Won't necessarily match the prompts for either of these readathons, but are books that I would like to get to. So I have quite the ambitious stack for November. I'm hoping I can get to all of them. We'll see. And I think the reason why there are so many is because a lot of them are relatively small, or at least small looking. We'll see if I can actually get to them. So yeah, I guess what I'll go ahead and do is go through the prompts for both of these readathons and let you know what I plan on reading for each prompt, if it fits, and then give you references. Refer you to books that I think would best fit these. So Indigathon's first prompt is to read the group book, which is Apple in the Middle. I don't currently have this book, and with most of my Indigenous lit, I like to have them physically. I just haven't bought this yet, and I don't foresee myself buying this within the next month or so I'm not doing this. The second prompt is to read a book with Indigenous Joy, and both the hosts have recommendations for this. Bear has Fry Bread as a recommendation, and then Michelle has Winter Counts. Both of those books could also go with a prompt later on, so keep that in mind. For what I plan on reading for Indigenous Joy, let me go through my stack here. What I'm going to go with is My Sisters by Chag Lowry and Weishiot Alvitre. This is a really relatively short graphic novel that honors the special relationship that basket weavers have with their homelands, and it's, yeah, this unique story told through the perspectives of the baskets themselves. So I have read Chag Lowry before. His graphic novel Unknown Soldier is one that I really like the art of, and really like the story of, particularly because it pertains to and meant like it's based off of multiple stories told by Iraq people that were in World War II. So it was something here locally. This one I think could also work for a prompt later on. So yeah. And then my other option for this as well is Redbone, the true story of a Native American rock band. And this is also a graphic novel, which I was really surprised about. I did not expect that until like my partner pointed it out when he flipped through it, but he really wants to read this as well, and he flipped through it and happened to notice it was a graphic novel. So a nice surprise. I kind of had an issue thinking about this prompt, just trying to figure out what is Indigenous Joy, and I think that's ultimately unapologetically Indigenous. Not so much like going through our trauma or recognizing that trauma. So in terms of recommendations, I'm thinking of books that they're Indigenous, the main character is Indigenous, and that's just fine. I'm gonna have 2 books to recommend to you, and the first is my favorite from 2020, and that is A Lot's Away by Darcy Little Badger. This one follows Ellie, who is Lipan Apache. She is also Ace, much like the author Darcy Little Badger. She is living in a world where creatures of myth and legend are real. Fairies are real, elves are real, and as well as vampires, etc. And Ellie has the ability to raise ghosts, but she is still coming into her power of this power that has been passed down from generation to generation within her family line. One night after her cousin's death, he comes to her in a dream saying that he was murdered, saying who murdered him and how, and ultimately he just wants to know why and wants Ellie and her family to protect his wife and young child. So when they go to his place, there is a small town that seems glamorous and normal, but is actually fairly deceitful, and has fairly big secrets that it's hiding, and it's up to Ellie and her friends and her family to figure out what's going on and why. I absolutely enjoyed this book. It does read a bit younger than young adult. I believe Ellie is like in her late teens, and I feel like it reads a bit like younger. I would say almost middle grade, but ultimately it is a really adorable book. I absolutely loved it. And then my next recommendation is Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Booley. I absolutely loved the language in here. We are following Adonis Fontaine, who is an unenrolled member of Ojibwe, but she practices her culture every day. She prays, she is practicing every day being Indigenous, and being in her culture, and that is so beautiful. And throughout this whole book there is the Ojibwe language. This is a great book to listen to via audiobook to, one, get the accurate pronunciations of these words, but also just like, I love how Adonis is so just involved despite being unenrolled, which is really a colonial prospect of trying to eliminate Native Americans, that she is pushing to be her best Indigenous self, which I absolutely love. This does have some heavier topics in it. Adonis ends up witnessing a murder of a close friend, and ends up getting roped into an FBI investigation to figure out where drugs are coming from into her reservation, or into the nearby reservation. So there are some heavier topics of that, but Adonis herself, I believe, is the epitome of Indigenous joy. Next prompt is read a host recommendation. So Bear recommended Fry Bread by Kevin Noble Maillard, illustrated by Juana Martinez Neal. I don't know what this is about. I believe this is about family. I have yet to read this. This was Bear's recommendation for Indigenous Joy, so I am excited to get to this. I've been wanting to read it for a while, but have been saving it for this readathon in particular. So I'm excited to get to it. And then Michelle's recommendation was Winter Counts, which I have read and I have enjoyed. I have this up. This was a buddy read that I read with Kim from Native Book Lady Warrior, and this one is set on the Rosebud Reservation, Indian Reservation. It's following, what's his name, Virgil Wounded Horse, who is kind of a vigilante within the reservation because there are things that happen on the reservation that tribal police don't really do, but then don't really take care of, or there's no justice within this reservation. So Virgil Wounded Horse takes justice into his own hands and is of sort the reservation vigilante. But when drugs start coming onto the reservation and his nephew is involved, he gets roped into figuring out where these drugs are coming from and how to stop it, with the help of his ex-girlfriend. And yeah, things ensue. I really like the explanation of jurisdiction in this book, particularly the complications of reservation jurisdiction, because reservations in general are federal, not state. So state police don't tend to do anything, and federal investigators are too busy or find that Indigenous issues aren't important enough to deal with. So that's a complication. It was also just interesting to read at the time of reading this. We were having jurisdiction issues of our own here locally, as multiple of the reservations here locally wanted to completely shut down and block out any people going through due to the pandemic, because we wanted to keep our elders and our community safe. Unfortunately, all the reservations that are here locally have a major highway or road going through them, and that is state issue. So it was this interesting battle of figuring out, okay, what can we do, how can we go through this, and how can we protect our elders. So that was fairly interesting while reading this book. Next for Indigathon is to read a nonfiction. So this one I had meant to read in September and didn't get to it. That is Native Apparitions by Critical Perspectives on Hollywood's Indians, edited by Steve Pavlik, M. Elise Marubio, and Tom Home. I don't believe any of these editors are, I believe Tom Home may be Indigenous. I was trying to do this before filming, but I did it a couple days ago, so I don't quite remember. But ultimately, I'm pretty interested in reading this book still. I just wasn't able to get to it. This is a library book that I have out from my little university library that I work at, which is Humboldt State University. Most of our collection is off limits right now, but someone returned this and I promptly checked it out. But especially after reading We Had a Little Real Estate Problem, of which I posted a full review on my channel, so please check that out, by Cliff Nestroff, who is also not Indigenous, but is a comedy historian, and I think does a really good job in terms of writing this book about Indigenous people in comedy and entertainment industry. And after reading this book, it made me really excited to get into this one, so I do still very much want to read it. In terms of in terms of recommendations, I would have to recommend this one, a nonfiction, though know that, like I said, Cliff Nestroff is not Indigenous, but like I said, has a bunch, I think does a really good job in terms of the history of Indigenous people in comedy and the entertainment industry, and the current goings on of Native people in that entertainment industry. So, and of course, I personally can't talk about Indigenous nonfiction without actually mentioning this author, because as of this year, they're one of my favorite authors, and I like am constantly searching for new works. About that is Robin Wall Kimmerer. Braiding Sweetgrass is most likely one of the top books that I have read in 2021. I absolutely loved it. I particularly read it in a place that I was just kind of feeling at a low, and it was the right book at the right time. But I absolutely enjoyed this book. This is a collection of essays written by Robin Wall Kimmerer as well as her daughters, that basically talks about her knowledge, really. So she is Potawatomi, and she is a botanist, and she grew up with Indigenous knowledge from her father and her mother, and that those teachings. But when going into botany and going into the science field, they made her believe that some of the things that she had wanted to learn isn't science. So they kind of essentially brainwashed her into thinking that she had to think a certain way to be a botanist. But now, as a teacher herself in botany, she has so many teachings that is able to combine her Indigenous teachings with botany, and like the importance of reciprocity and research in general, and like basically returning land to what it was before settler colonialism. So I absolutely love this. It was a great mix of narration and research. I absolutely loved it. And of course her book Gathering Moss, which is essentially, if you took one of these chapters and asked her to expand on it, this is essentially what it is. It's more essays, more research, more Indigenous knowledge that I absolutely loved. I loved finding the connections between how moss is used here locally to how the Potawatomi use it, and in fact further. So if you are looking for a nonfiction by an Indigenous author, I highly suggest Robin Wall Kimmerer. I also really enjoyed The Following As You Were by David Tremblay. This was one of the first books that I read of 2021, and it was very impactful. It felt like a family member was telling me their life story. It is not an easy life story. This David Tremblay goes through the cyclical traumas that have been happening in his life because his grandmother was in boarding school. So it's kind of the violence that comes from that. So, and their violence and mental health. It was a hard book to read. Weirdly balanced with some dark humor that I found funny, and I don't know if it was because it's considered like Indigenous. It's one of those things where you either laugh or you have to cry. You either have to laugh, otherwise you'll cry. But yes, definitely an intense book. Definitely a memorable book that I highly suggest, but know that it is fairly heavy. Another one that I really enjoyed was Apple Skin Decor by Eric Gansworth. This is marketed as more of a young adult middle grade nonfiction. I think anyone and everyone should read it, but essentially Eric Gansworth goes through his life, and this is a collection of mixed media poetry. This would also work great for another prompt, but basically it's dissecting the slur of apple, which has been used on Indigenous people, where you look Indigenous but you act white. And basically Eric is going through his life of living on a reservation but not being a part of that particular tribe, or nation. So it was really interesting. It was definitely one where I was listening to it at first, and then after a while I followed along. And that is probably the way that I would suggest reading it, because it is beautiful to hear, like, and particularly with poetry. And I do this with Elizabeth Acevedo and other poets, where I listen to them reading their own poetry as I'm reading their book that happens to be in verse, because there's a certain context that we miss when we're just reading someone else's poetry, that we don't have that emphasis in their voice of where they wanted it to be, or that emotion of where it's placed. So it was just really nice to hear Eric narrate his own book, as well as going through it, as well as there's other mixed media imagery in here as well that kind of helps out with that. And then this is also a nonfiction book, but it's authored by someone of Indigenous descent. I don't think they claim a particular tribe, nation, or people, but they are aware that they are of Indigenous descent, but aren't, yeah, like I said, aren't claiming anything. But I do highly suggest this book for anyone who just doesn't know where to start in terms of Indigenous history, and that is An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Oritz. This is the for young people edition. I suggest either one, really. There's just certain things that are missing, particularly in this one. Another one that I read audibly or listened to through my library that I actually really enjoyed. It's basically like Indigenous History 101. We're going through everything. We're going through bits and pieces of everything. I particularly really enjoyed it because there was mention of Yurok. So it's always makes my ears perk up. But I do suggest it for anyone who doesn't quite know where to start. So this is the prompt that I'm not going to be able to refer you to, because this is something you have to do research on yourself, and that is Land Acknowledgement. Read a book by an Indigenous author whose tribal lands you live on. I live on unceded Wiyot territory, but after doing some research, there hasn't been any books authored by a Wiyot person. So what I figure is that my sister's work, because Chag Larry is Yurok, but also another nonfiction that I've been meaning to get to for years now is We Are Dancing for You, Native Feminisms and the Revitalization of Women's Coming of Age Ceremonies by Kacha Singh Baldi. This is a relatively short, but I've tried reading this before. The introduction is a little dense. The font is relatively small. But Kacha Singh Baldi is a family friend and is a Hoopa tribal member, which is about an hour inland. But that is like, I guess I could look for Yurok or more, I mean, Chag Lowry's Yurok. But others, like, there are 12 tribes in this area, and this is the one I currently have. So I think I'm going to go with this because I've been meaning to read it, like I said, for years. This was published in 2017. And like I said, Kacha's a family friend, so I feel like I need to read it. But also, I was one of the girls that she interviewed for this book. So this is revolving around a coming of age ceremony that has been and is continuing to be revitalized here in the local area for young girls becoming young women. Myself and some cousins that Kacha interviewed are like quoted in here, so I'm really interested in that. As well as just how she views it. I know that recently, within the last week, more tribes Rancheria recently just did their first coming of age ceremony for a young girl in the first time in the last 150 years. So this is huge. So the fact that these are being brought back and continuously being brought back by local tribes is amazing. I know that other tribes outside of this area, other tribes, nations, and peoples outside of this area have similar ceremonies. They're not going to completely reflect their ceremonies here locally, but it's something that I particularly am really interested in because it fights the taboo of periods being taboo. Periods really shouldn't be. It's a natural part of nature. That's always something that I'm striving to fight against. Probably not so much here on my YouTube channel just because it hasn't ever really been brought up, but it's something that I try to fight for in my life of just periods shouldn't be taboo. We celebrate young girls becoming young women. But like I said, when it comes to the recommendations for these, I really can't recommend anything. You're going to have to do your own research on that based on where you are. For that, I'd suggest your local library or even your look for what tribe you're on. I know that there's, or what land, whose land you're on. There, I believe it's an app where you can text, or like a particular phone number where you can text where you currently are, and it'll tell you whose land you're on. And then it's just like getting a hold of a local library to see if they have any authors from that tribe, nation, or people, or even like seeing if that nation, tribe, or people has a website. So the next prompt is to read a book with your favorite color on the cover. Again, another one that I can't necessarily reference because I don't know what your favorite color is. My favorite color happens to be a slate blue, which is kind of a grayish blue. And for that, I'm picking Healer of the Water Monster by Brian Young. This is a Navajo story following Nathan, who is going to his grandma Nally's mobile home on the Navajo reservation, and he knows the summer with no running water and no electricity is gonna be some trouble, but he's gonna be okay with it. And then one night when he's lost in a nearby desert, Nathan finds an extraordinary holy being of the Navajo creation story, a water monster in the need of help. So this sounds really cute, and another possible one for Indigenous Joy. It has multiple different varieties of blue on the cover, so I'm okay with that. This also works for Magical Readathon TBR for the Heritage list of reading a book with an element on the cover to be, is it an elemental? What is it called? An earthling? No, I want to be a water earthling, so reading something with water in a water buzzword in the title. So I guess what I could do is show you some books with some beautiful covers. So I'll recommend you some books that I think have gorgeous covers by Indigenous authors. The first being Race to the Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is a Navajo inspired story. Rebecca Roanhorse is a Black Indigenous author who is Pueblo, I believe. I know there's been some question on that. That's what she has stated she is. That is what I'm going with. But she's also married into a Navajo family. So it's tricky. Navajo inspired. But we are following this. I learned how to pronounce this once, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to mispronounce it now. Nizhoni Begay. She's able to detect monsters. And when her father gets a new job and has his new boss over for dinner, Nizhoni recognizes that his new boss is a monster. So when she tries to warn him, though, no one believes her. And so when her dad is kidnapped by this monster, it's up to Nizhoni and her little brother to go find their dad with the help of her best friend, Dave Ray. So I thought was really cool. There's a lot of exploration into Navajo territory. Ultimately, I personally didn't quite enjoy Nizhoni. I thought she was very, I just didn't really connect with her as a character, but this book as a whole was pretty interesting and fun. So it is a middle grade. It is a Rick Riordan Presents. So, and the cover is gorgeous. Another one is going to also be by Rebecca Roanhorse, but this is a fantasy, and it is the first fantasy that I've seen that is inspired by pre-colonial Americas or pre-Columbian Americas. So that's definitely something. Most fantasies are based off of Western Europe. So but that is Black Sun. That cover is absolutely gorgeous. I'm a little disheartened with the sequel cover release of Fevered Star, but I mean, we get what we get, I guess. This one in particular is like I said, a fantasy. We are following multiple perspectives as the city of Toba is getting closer to its winter solstice, in which is a time for celebration and renewal, but this year coincides with a solar eclipse, a rare celestial event proscribed by the sun priest as an unbalancing of the world. So there's a lot of intrigue in here. This is, I believe, the first book that I've recognized as one with political intrigue that actually intrigued me. I'm not usually for any political intrigue, but this one really had me interested and invested. There are multiple characters that I really enjoyed and really wanted. Like, we follow multiple perspectives, and yes, some get more than others. Others seem almost kind of pointless, but at the same time, I'm interested and invested in all of them, and I'm eager to see what happens in the sequel. that is coming out in 2022. That's one thing Rebecca Roanhorse's writing that I absolutely love, is that she keeps me interested. And then finally, we have The Removed by Brandon Hobson. This one, that cover is just absolutely gorgeous. Obviously, that's why I'm recommending it. This is a Book of the Month book that was offered that I was really excited about. I had also got the ARC, so that was cool too. This does deal with some heavier topics. A teenage boy, Ray Ray, is killed in a police shooting. The Ekota family has been suspended in grief for the last 15 years. And basically, we are following multiple perspectives of this family as they are still grieving for this loss 15 years later. So we are following Ray Ray's sister, who finds herself in a relationship with someone who is connected to the shooting. We follow his brother, who has been dealing with self-medication and alcohol for a while, and able to numb the pain that was caused by Ray Ray's passing. We also are still following Ray Ray's mother, who has decided to foster a child after her children have left the nest of sorts, to kind of, in a way, to fill that gap that Ray Ray left, but at the same time hoping that it would help her husband, Ray Ray's father, who is dealing with early stages of dementia. But when the kid shows up that they're fostering, there are so many things that remind them of Ray Ray, that her husband is convinced that this is in fact Ray Ray, in a new form of sorts. So it is a really heavy book, but it is a very beautiful book based, I believe it is coming up to Ray Ray's anniversary that also coincides with the Cherokee National Holiday. They're all wondering just what will happen as they find each other again. So it is a beautiful story. It is a relatively heavy story. So Indigathon's next prompt is to read an Indigenous poetry collection. I'm not going with poetry, but I am going with some collections. So this is probably the most ambitious part of my TBR because there's so many in here, but because they all are relatively short, I think I can handle it. The first is Anoka by Shane Hawk. This is a collection of short stories from Shane Hawk, and it's Welcome to Anoka, Minnesota, a small city just outside the Twin Cities, dubbed the Halloween capital of the world since 1937. Here before you lie several tales involving bone collectors, pagan witches, werewolves, skeletal bison, and cloned children. It is up to you to decipher between fact and fiction, as the author has woven historical facts into his narratives with his debut horror collection. Cheyenne and Arapaho author Shane Hawk explores themes of family, grief, loneliness, and identity through the lens of Indigenous life. I also hope to get to, this one isn't so much on the top of my TBR, but it is one I am interested in because I'm still in that spooky vibe. It's still October when I'm filming this, so we'll see if that continues into November. But that is It Came from the Multiplex, 80s Midnight Chillers, directed by Joshua Viola. But this is essentially a collection of short stories, horror stories, and one of which is written by Stephen Graham Jones. I think Stephen Graham Jones is the only Indigenous author here, but I'm not entirely sure on that. All I know is that I'm fairly interested. I'm loving the VHS covers that are coming out. My Heart is a Chainsaw was the arc was kind of promoted as such, as an old VHS, which was pretty cool. This whole paperback VHS style, it's one of the reasons why I also want to get my Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix, because I'm loving these like VHS styled covers. Next, I have Urban Tribes, Native Americans in the City. This could be considered a collection of poetry, but it also has so much more. It has art, it has photography, and basically this is edited by Lisa Charlie Boy and Mary Beth Leatherdale. I've read something similar to from them before called #Not Your Indian Princess. This, as well as another one that I have checked out from my mom's library, which is actually a curriculum resource center but that is Dreaming in Indian, Contemporary Native American Voices, edited also by Lisa Charlie Boy and Mary Beth Leatherdale. Both of these I've been wanting to get to. I've had this for a bit now, but I do want to get to both of these. Both of these do have poetry collections in them. It's just not all by the same people. It's also like has more. It has art, it has photography, it's just a collection from various voices. So that I'm pretty excited about. And then I also have an anthology, I believe is also in the same essence of Urban Tribes and Dreaming in Indian, in which it's a collection from various different authors, artists, and people. But this is Dear Woman, an anthology. I don't remember who this is by or edited by. It doesn't say on the book itself. Edited by Elizabeth Lepensi and Weshiot Elvitre. So yeah, it has a bunch of writers and artists. I see Darcy Little Badger is in here. Jackie Fawn, which I know as an artist, a Yurok artist actually, who is really cool. Rebecca Roanhorse, and I'm sure more that I don't recognize. So I'm excited to get into this as well. This was kindly given to me by Neil, so thank you so much, Neil. But those three are the three that I plan to read for the Indigenous Poetry Collection. Recommendations for this, once again, I would have to recommend Apple from Skin Decor by Eric Gansworth, as this is essentially written in verse. I don't know if that's necessarily considered a poetry collection. I'm not all that into poetry, though I have been meaning to get to some Joy Harjo. I just don't have any of her works, and I haven't had time to go scour my mom's library for Joy Harjo, though I'm sure she has some in her personal collection, as they are good friends. But I also recommend Not Your Indian Princess. This I have read before. This is also by Lisa Charlie Boy and Mary Beth Leatherdale. This is Voices of Native American Women, and basically it has the same prospects of there's art, there's photography, there's short stories, there's poetry. So yeah, those are the two I would recommend. I apologize that I could not recommend more for this. As I said, I'm not that into poetry, so but I hope to be able to recommend more in the future. I had a duh moment as I was looking at my shelves. There's more I can recommend for poetry. That is Earthkeeper by N. Scott Momaday. And it's reflections on the American land. So this is poetry collections that are told in two parts. The first half is pre-colonial and the second half is post-colonial. So this was a relatively refreshing read that I read at the beginning of 2021. Yes, as well as The Smokehouse Boys. I don't know how available this will be though, because I believe it's out of print. But The Smokehouse Boys, it is a collection of poems by Shauna Oteka Makovi, who is actually a Hoopa, I believe, Yurok and Karuk poet. So I really enjoyed a couple of these poems. I read this last year. There were some I didn't quite understand. I know that my mom absolutely loves it, and I think it's just that kind of age group or particular experience on living on the reservation. I only lived on the Hoopa Reservation for about 6 years, so I don't particularly have the same experiences as Shauna and my mom. So there was a slight disconnect there, but there were some that I absolutely loved. I particularly really enjoyed The Smokehouse Boys poem, which this collection is named after. And there was an element of like different senses being awoken to as I read this. I remember smelling smoke from a campfire and just various things that made me miss ceremony. The last prompt I don't have anything for that I plan on reading actually, and that is to read a book with an elder protagonist. I'm sure I have something in my collection, it's not in my current want to read TBR at the moment. What I can recommend for this though is There by Tommy Orange. Multiple perspectives as it leads up to the Oakland powwow, and one of these perspectives is one that I actually really kind of liked, as they both I think, is it both of them that we get or one of them, that they're sisters. But one of them in particular that we follow, she has been sober for a couple years and works as a counselor. And we kind of get bits and pieces of her past, and she's coming from out of state to come to the Oakland powwow to see her sister and her grandkids, I believe, because it's actually her daughter's kids that her sister is looking after, because she realized that she couldn't be the one taking care of them. But she reflects on being at Alcatraz during the protest of giving Alcatraz back to its native people. This was a decent book from what I remember. I feel like it's been a couple years since I read it. Maybe it's only been a year. I can't quite remember. That's one thing with this book, is that there are multiple perspectives that there were more perspectives than I was really hoping for. I know that that's often a critique that is kind of fought against, because, like, I mean, some people are able to read fantasies with 6 freaking characters and be able to keep track of everything, and yet they can't read this. But I have a hard time with multiple perspectives in any degree of genre. So that was one thing I had a hard time with, but there are multiple specific perspectives, particularly that of the sister I was just talking about, that really stuck with me. There are also younger perspectives of, I believe, her grandkids, as well as other Indigenous people living in Oakland, getting ready for the Oakland powwow. Particularly, there was one in particular that I really enjoyed, I believe, of her grandchild that was wanting to dance in the powwow, but never learned how, so he taught himself, which I thought was really sweet. So that is it for the Indigathon TBR of sorts. There are more books I would like to read by Indigenous authors that I have on my TBR that didn't quite fit the prompts. The first is Tim Tingle's When a Ghost Talks, Listen. This is the sequel to How I Became a Ghost by Tim Tingle, following a young Choctaw boy as he is forced on the trail of tears. I believe this is middle grade, but it made me cry so hard. So I'm interested to see where this one goes, as there is no synopsis on the back. So I'm not sure where this one will lead. So I'm curious about that. Another sequel I would like to get to is Storm of Locusts by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the sequel to The Trail of Lightning, where we are following Maggie Hoskey in a post-apocalyptic of sorts. Basically, climate change has changed the world. The Navajo have put up walls around their reservation just before or just after the Great Flood to keep outsiders out of the reservation, basically. And when this climate change happened, like the Great Flood, they entered into the sixth world. Essentially, all beings of Navajo myth and legend are amongst them now, or amongst the people. With that, though, comes the monsters as well. Maggie Hoskey is a monster slayer. So this is another Navajo-inspired story by Rebecca Roanhorse. Maggie Hoskey is a monster slayer, and in the Trail of Lightning, she is trying to figure out where these monsters are coming from and how to stop them. And in this one, I believe we are directly following the results of the first book. So I gave the first book a 3-star, but like I said, Rebecca Roanhorse, I think it's 3-star, 2.5. Rebecca Roanhorse has a great way of like wanting me to like putting enough intrigue towards the end, or like even throughout the book, that makes me go, okay, how does this end though? So despite not quite enjoying Trail of Lightning, I still want to figure out where the series is going. My final book for Indigathon, or for reading Indigenous books, is Sisters of the Neversea by Cynthia Letek Smith. This is a Peter Pan retelling following Wendy and Lily, who I believe are adopted sisters. They are stepsisters. But when their father takes one place and their mother stays at home with the other, they fear that this may change their relationship. But when Peter Pan decides to take their brother Michael, I believe. Yeah, so they're wondering what this separation means for their families, particularly for their little brother Michael. Lily is Muskogee Cree. Little do they know, a boy who intends to take them away from home for good to an island of wild animals, fairies, and kidnapped children, to a sea of merfolk, pirates, and giant crocodile. So this one I'm fairly curious about. After reading Lost in the Neverwoods by Aidan Thomas, I wasn't sure how I would continuously feel about Peter Pan retellings, as Peter Pan as a story itself doesn't tend to delight me because of its Indigenous stereotypes and kind of grouping Indigenous people with fairies and mythological creatures. So I'm curious to see how Cynthia does it as an Indigenous author. Nonfiction November, I don't plan to read like a whole lot, as you can tell from my Indigathon TBR. I have quite a lot already, but there are 2 books in particular that I would like to get to for Nonfiction November. Mostly because one of them is due soon. So the prompts for Nonfiction November is collection, industry, style, and treatment. So I just added, so there's 4 more books I would like to get to. 2 of which are library books, one of which is due relatively soon, so I need to get to that. So let's go with collection. What I plan on reading for that is Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask by Anton Truer. This is a young reader's edition that was given to me by Levine Corrido, so thank you so much. And basically, this is a collection of questions that people have asked and have answers to. So I am excited for this. I was going to read this audibly, but it looks like there are some pictures in here, and I think this will be a good one to read throughout the month and just kind of read in bits and pieces. But essentially, yeah, it's from the acclaimed Ojibwe and Professor Anton Truer comes an essential book of questions and answers for Native and non-Native young readers alike, ranging from why is there such a fuss about non-Native people wearing Indian costumes for Halloween, to why is it called a traditional Indian fry bread taco, to what's it like for Natives who don't look Native, to why are Indians so often imagined rather than understood. So this is a collection of questions and answers, so that's what I'm going with this. That's one thing with Nonfiction November, hosted by Olive, and I believe another slew of hosts, is that the prompts are relatively loose and they're typically one word, so you can interpret them how you would like. So for recommendations, I could say, once again, like #NotYourPrincess for a collection of voices of Native American women of various degrees. So writers, poets, artists, illustrators, photographers, etc. This would be a good one for that. Apple is, I think, I keep considering this a poetry collection. I'm not sure if that's it, but that would be. Braiding Sweetgrass would be a good one for this because it's a collection of essays from Robin Wall Kimmerer and her daughter. For industry, I am going to actually read American Catch, The Fight for Our Local Seafood by Paul Greenberg. This I have been interested in a while. I think I found this on a list of nonfiction books on Goodreads, actually. This is not by an Indigenous author, and is in fact a borrowed library book from SCSU, so thank you Fresno State University for sending this my way. I am very interested in what this is. I need to take off the thing so I could read you the... Paul Greenberg sets out in American Catch to answer a simple yet troubling question: why aren't Americans eating American seafood? In 2005, the United States imported 5 billion pounds of seafood, nearly double what we imported 20 years earlier. Bizarrely, during that same period, our seafood exports quadrupled. American Catch examines New York oysters, Gulf shrimp, and Alaskan salmon to reveal how it came to be that as much as 91% of seafood Americans eat is foreign. Despite the challenges, hope abounds. In New York City, the Gulf of Mexico, and Alaska, Greenberg finds unlikely alliances forming to stop the destruction and chart a path forward. So this one I have been curious in, and recently got more curious in after, I don't have the book physically, after reading Animal Vegetable Junk by Mark Bittman, so, which I'll put here. But ultimately, I just finished this, so you'll hear more about it in my October wrap-up. But this one would also be a good one for industry, as it talks about agriculture in America and how it influenced essentially the world and changed the world and how we see food, and how food has essentially, like, how it's never been prioritized as feeding the people, but rather just industrialized to make a profit. So after reading that one in particular, as it briefly mentioned about seafood, I would love to hear more about the seafood industry, mostly because a lot of the vegans I know still eat fish, oddly enough, because their whole, like, I'm not saying all vegans are like this, just particular ones that I've talked to, they still eat fish because they feel that the reason, I don't know if it's, and I'm not sure why, I need to talk to them more about it, but it's interesting to me that some vegans feel like it's okay to eat fish when and not eat pork or beef or chickens because of the industry behind it, which I get, I totally understand. But at the same time, you have to understand too that our fishing industry is no better. So that's what gets me, is that the fishing industry can be worse, can be about the same if not worse than the meat industry that is America. So, excuse me. So that's what I want to learn more about, and I think that's one of the reasons why I haven't talked to these vegan friends about this, because I want to know more about it before I get into it with a discussion. Another one for industry is Our Native Bees, North America's Endangered Pollinators and the Fight to Save Them. Bees, I feel like in general, like, as much as I would love it not to be an industry, it very much is. A lot of the honeybees are carted around through California and the United States to make sure that our California, like, is a major production of our fruits and vegetables. So bees are carted around throughout California to make sure that we have almonds and oranges and all this stuff to make sure we can feed America. And bees are a major part of that. So this book was actually really interesting in terms of an introduction to bees, and particularly native bees, as we figure out, like, as honeybees are dying off, like, how bad are they dying off versus bumblebees, how bad are they dying off? Is it pollution? Is it pesticides? And she kind of, in page Embry, gets into that, but also how we as people, as civilians, can encourage native bees for pollination. And I think because of that, our native bees are kind of in the industry now, as well as a lot of farmers are utilizing them, as they're realizing that honeybees, each and every single bee, type of bee, has its own preference of which flower it's going to pollinate. And as farmers realize this and realize that diversifying a farm is the best way to get pollinators and best way to get product. So this was really interesting in that. There is quite a bit of scientific lingo in here that kind of lost me in particular, but it's also fairly interesting as we get to know each and every one of the bees. I do hope at some point to get further into this as well. But for style, I plan on reading, and I dislike when libraries do this, but to each their own. I plan on reading Miyazaki World by Susan Napier. I believe this is essentially let's see, a 13th century toxic jungle, a bathhouse for tired gods, a red-haired fish girl, and a fairy woodland spirit. What do these have in common? They all spring from the mind of Hayao Miyazaki, one of the greatest living animators known worldwide for films such as My Neighbor Totoro, Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, and The Wind Rises. Japanese culture and animation scholar Susan Napier explores the life and art of this extraordinary Japanese filmmaker to provide a definite account of his hors d'oeuvre. I don't know. Napier insightfully illuminates the multiple themes crisscrossing his work, from empowered women to environmental nightmares to utopian dreams, creating an unforgettable portrait of a man whose art challenged Hollywood dominance and ushered in a new chapter of global popular culture. So I think this would work for style in general because, I mean, Miyazaki has a very specific style of art. I really fell in love with, I don't have it with me, with Howl's Moving Castle to the point where I got like a book about the art for it. I just absolutely love it. And the fact that Miyazaki encourages his animators to start from scratch in terms of doing sketches, doing watercolors, storyboarding before getting into the animation. It's very, I believe, considered old school at that point because it's definitely something that like even Disney is starting to phase out. Thank you, Sacramento State University, for sending this book my way. It's definitely one I am very curious about and hope that I can get to. But my TBR is, oh my god, it's so big. For recommendations of style, I have 2 books. The first one is in The Dream House, a memoir by Carmen Maria Machado. This is very much for her style of writing because it is very much Carmen Maria Machado's writing. She does it in such a poetic and way, and it's almost terrifying. This in general is kind of following Carmen as she explores a toxic relationship she was in, and kind of helps expand the idea and the reality that LGBTQ people, queer people, lesbian couples, gay couples can have toxic relationships and in fact had abusive relationships, in which she explores here. And there was like moments in here that I felt lost because I felt like I didn't understand it, but at the same time there were multiple things in here where it made my heart skip because I was freaked out for Carmen. So that I would definitely have to push and recommend for just Carmen's style of writing. And then also for style, I have Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. I think binding in human skin can be a particular style. This is by Megan Rosenblum. I also did a full review of this one not too long ago if you want to check that out, but basically this is basically as it says, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. But it's so much more than that. It goes into like the history of true crime and and our interest in it, as well as medical history, which this could go into, could potentially be an industry, as well as she talks about the medical industry and the clinical gaze in terms of the this kind of essentially this removal of emotions that doctors tend to have towards their patients and kind of look at them more as an object rather than a person. So this is kind of morbid, but also fairly interesting. I love books like this. So, and finally, Treatment. And for this, I am going to hopefully do We Are the Land, A History of Native California by Damon B. Atkins and William J. Bauer Jr. This is, let's see here, writing the history of California as indigenous. Before there was such a thing as California, there were the people and the land. Manifest Destiny, the Gold Rush, and Settler Colonial Society drew maps, displaced indigenous people, and reshaped the land, but they did not make California. Rather, the lives and legacies of the people native to the land shaped the creation of California. We Are the Land is the first text of its kind, centering the long history of California around the lives and legacies of indigenous people who shaped it. Beginning with the ethnogenesis of California Indians, the narrative recounts the centrality of the native presence from European colonization through statehood, paying particularly close attention to the presence of activism of California Indians in the late 20th century and early 21st century. The book definitely contextualizes the first encounters with Europeans, Spanish missions, Mexican secularization, the devastation of the gold rush and statehood, genocide efforts to reclaim land, and the organization and activism of sovereignty that built today's casino economy. Yeah, so this in general can be considered a treatment in terms of how California Indigenous people have been treated. So as a California Indigenous person, I am very particularly interested in this. Particularly, I'm wondering if they're going to focus more on Southern California or all of California as a whole. So I'm very interested in that. Also, I love like the sepia type tone of this cover. So yeah. I'm hoping I can get to this month. This is a lot of books, y'all. For my recommendations for treatment, I can once again do an Indigenous people's history, as is the treatment of Indigenous people throughout our history of the United States. So, by Roxanne Dunbar Oritz. I could also recommend As You Were by David Tremblay, as we see the treatment cyclical response to boarding schools and those who manage to survive it and what happens to their families afterwards, particularly David Tremblay's family. Could also do Braiding Sweetgrass. Once again, that's I think would work for all of these in all honesty, but this one in particular for treatment, it could be the treatment of plants, the treatment of knowledge, the treatment of land. There's a bunch of things that Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer could be interpreted as, of which I really appreciate. Like, if I can get everyone to read this book, that'd be great. I also have How to Be a Good Creature by Cy Montgomery, a memoir of 13 animals. This one was really cute. I remember reading it. Ooh, man, it is pouring. But I thought it was really cute. So it could be very well the treatment of animals or the treatment that you felt of animals, or particularly of Cy Montgomery. This cover is absolutely gorgeous as well. So, just treatment, I guess, in different ways. It's just like all of these animals Cy Montgomery had interactions with at some point in their life. So, that treatment in a way. I don't, why? This is my November TBR. There is, I'm having some thoughts. One, that's heavy. Two, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 14, 15, 16. There is 16 books on this. So we'll see just how many I can get to. I am excited for each and every one. If you have read any of these, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you have recommendations for either of these prompts, bonus points if they cross over with one another, if you can double up. So they're by an Indigenous author, they count for Indigathon, and Nonfiction November. I don't know why I'm giving out points. It's not like you're going to win anything. But yeah. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Yeah, otherwise, let me know what you plan on reading for Indigathon and or Nonfiction November. I would love to hear it. If you've made it this far, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up. If you have to do so already, please be sure to subscribe and hit the little bell icon to get notified when I post more content. I feel like I did a lot of talking, so I apologize if my voice is kind of going out. I know I wrecked my bookshelf, so I'm gonna need to fix that. Otherwise, please be sure to check out my race awareness links down in the description down below as well. And I hope that you are in the mental mindset to enjoy your reading. I will see you in another video very soon. Chew.